Well, hello my friend, and welcome back. Today we are going to talk about a topic that is incredibly important for us to understand. If you've been doing any sort of research on narcissistic or toxic relationships, you've probably figured out at this point that narcissistic people have an incredible need to have control over the people and situations in their life. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfy, and let's talk about it. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of this, let's talk about why this is really an important video for you to watch. Not only are we going to talk about the ways that they assert control over people, but we're also going to talk about why. And trust me, by the end of this, you're going to have a very clear understanding about it, and when you can understand it, then you can actually start telling yourself the real story about your situation and be able to move forward and accept what has happened to you. So like I said, before we talk about the how, let's talk about the why. It all comes down to two core reasons, and the first one is it solidifies their supply. You see, narcissistic people, they really thrive on attention and validation and even admiration. It's such a high need for them, almost like it's their need to breathe, like it is how they keep their sense of self inflated. So when they exert control over you, then they know that you are still within their reach. So when they assert this control over you, it keeps you under their grasp and therefore boosts their ego, which we all understand at this point is something that's absolutely mandatory for them. The second reason kind of goes along with this, but essentially it keeps you under their narcissistic spell. The more power that they have over you, the less likely that you are to question them or even try to challenge their behavior. And by controlling aspects of our lives or even our own thought process, it creates this extremely toxic dynamic to where we almost get addicted to their approval and their validation as well. This is why when you leave a narcissistic relationship, you have a very low sense of self-concept and you don't even understand who you are outside of this person. It's a vicious cycle and it's completely rooted in deceit. Let's talk about how they do this. And with every tactic that I give you, I'm going to give you what this looks like and why they use this particular tactic in the first place. One of the most common methods is the silent treatment. So some examples of a silent treatment is they are only going to speak to you when they need something. This usually occurs after some sort of argument or especially after you've tried to hold them accountable to their actions. It even could be as intense where they haven't literally spoken a word to you in days, even if you live together. Or maybe it's one of those situations where they talk to everyone around you, but they don't actually talk to you. It's a cycle of withdrawing attention and affection and communication. And again, this leads you to feel isolated and also having this desperate need for validation. There's a couple of reasons that they do this, and one of the most common reasons is it absolutely deflects responsibility of their actions. It's almost like a form of punishment for you, especially if you've tried to hold them accountable. And also, it's an incredibly almost smart way for them to manipulate you into some sort of intense reaction, because at some point it's going to drive you insane. And when you have this intense or averse reaction to their silent treatment, then now you've officially become the problem. The second tactic is going to be something called stonewalling, and you might have heard of this before. Stonewalling can be something as simple as just flat out dismissing you or dismissing your feelings. In my situation, it actually looked like where conversations were more of a one-way street. Like anytime that I tried to speak or anytime I tried to give my opinion on something, I was interrupted and I was shut down. And that's if you even have the pleasure of having conversations at all, because stonewalling and the silent treatment, they work really well together. Another way that this looks like is where they just shut down conversations that they don't want to have. And they'll shut down conversations for multiple reasons, but usually it's because they haven't figured out a way to explain it away yet, or they know that you're catching on to whatever it is that you're trying to have a conversation about. Another form of using power and control is manipulation. They are master manipulators. Different ways that they manipulate is just flat out lying, or they can even create situations where they actually end up manipulating you to the point where you're isolated. This was something that my abuser absolutely did, especially when it came to my relationship with my kid's mom. So essentially what he was doing is he was having this conversation with her, and on her end, it was positive for the most part. And then over here with me, he's telling me something completely different about the conversation that took place. And why he was doing this was because he was intimidated by the friendship and the closeness that me and my kid's mom still had. So he tried really hard to create this wedge in between us and actually turn us against each other. And they manipulate in so many different ways. So whether it is just straight lying, whether it's gaslighting, whether it's playing mind games with you, they want to keep you in this This is why rumination actually, by the way, this is kind of a side tangent, but this is why rumination actually ends up happening after the relationship is done, because it starts with things like this in the relationship. You're constantly ruminating while you're in a relationship with a narcissistic person, because there's something in our spirits that know that something's off with what they're saying or what they're doing, and we're sitting here in our head trying to put the pieces together and trying to make sense of everything, wondering if we're the problem, or wondering if we're just completely crazy, or wondering if we are just insecure or have an attitude problem. This starts very early on in the relationship, which is why rumination can be such a big deal after you get out, because it's a really bad habit that's been formed during the relationship and it just transfers after. Now, one of the most powerful forms of control, but in my opinion one of the least talked about, is fear. An example of this is the narcissistic rage, or my favorite was the road rage, or it can just be straight up physical abuse, or at the very least, threats of physical abuse. A narcissist is going to use intimidation or threats or even just emotional manipulation to keep you in compliance. And it's this constant cycle of essentially a power play that's exhausting to be on the receiving end of. And if you think about it, the reason why fear is such a commonly used tactic is because fear is one of the most ultimate paralyzers. I get the opportunity to talk to so many survivors, and one of the biggest reasons that people stayed as long as they did was because they were afraid. And there's so many things that we're afraid of. We're afraid of being out on our own, because again, with all this power and control, our concept of self has been wrapped up in this individual. Some people did flat out fear for their lives, and some people just feared of being able to make it on their own because of isolation and because of financial abuse and because of all these other things that kept them in control from the narcissist. And I remember saying a lot in the relationship that I felt like I was being bullied into submission. Because that's exactly what it was. It's, if I can't get my way, then I'm just going to bully you and rage and do all of this ridiculous stuff to get you to shut up and comply. So why do I think this is so important for you to understand as a survivor or someone trying to escape? When we leave these relationships, one of the things that we struggle with a lot is going to be self-deprecating talk. And I see a lot of survivors, they put a lot of blame on themselves, or they feel guilty for staying as long as they did, and they can essentially emotionally beat themselves up quite a bit. The danger with this is that it keeps you in a cycle of emotional abuse, but the difference is that you've become your own abuser. And when we can understand what we were going through, then we can start to tell ourselves the correct story. And what I mean by that is, instead of saying like, why did I stay for so long? I was such an idiot. We say, you know what? I stayed as long as I did because I was scared. I stayed as long as I did was because I was constantly questioning my every move. I didn't know if I was the problem or not. And when you can tell yourself the real story, you can start to treat yourself with more grace than you do judgment. And this is a key fact in healing from narcissistic abuse. You've been emotionally manipulated and gaslit and beat up long enough. Use this knowledge to help you reflect on your situation and try to tell yourself the correct story so that way you're no longer being so harsh on yourself. And when you start telling yourself the truth, then you can start taking steps forward to reaching radical acceptance.